Ladies and gentlemen, I'm excited to have Julie Kaplow. She's actually one of my favorites. I work with her at the Meadows Mental Health Foundation, along with Andy Keller, who is the CEO and president. And Julie is one of his top people. She deals in the area of PTSD when it relates to storms, tragedies, anything you can imagine. And she's sensitive. She goes where these problems are, and she helps people to overcome them. Julie is she's very distinguished. I mean, she is a clinical child and adolescent psychologist has a BA from the University of Michigan, a PhD from Duke, trained at Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. I mean, it goes on, and a Center for Medical and Refugee Trauma at Boston Medical Center. I mean, Andy needs to give you a raise, Julie.
Will you tell him that? That would be great.
Yes, I will. Julie, let's just start with this because I think people can learn when we see these terrible things that happen, whether they're tornadoes or whether they're big storms, whether they're hurricanes. Uh, when we saw the flooding in the rivers down in Texas, I think a lot of Americans say, "I want to go and help. Can I
Mhm.
go down there and can I do something?" Will you talk a little bit about why that doesn't work and what can people do?
Sure. It is such a common sort of urge for
It's a
people.
good urge, right? It's great.
Exactly. It's that altruistic sense of I want to help, I want to do something. And I think that people have the best of intentions when they're wanting to do that. What we have learned is that even the most seasoned clinicians who have dealt with trauma sometimes have not dealt with that very critical intersection of trauma and loss, where on top of the PTSD, you have bereaved and grieving individuals. And what we have found is that sometimes when well meaning clinicians sort of parachute in from outside and help, oftentimes if they're not prepared, they run the risk of actually developing vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, and will actually end up leaving early because they weren't prepared for that. So I think that's one sort of cautionary tale. And a lot of the work that we've been doing through the Trauma and Grief Center is actually the helping people ahead of time before they go out to those scenes, to get them prepared, to get them in a place where they feel more well equipped to deal with that more immediate aftermath. I do think over the longer term, though, we have had good success in training school and community based clinicians in those communities to be able to provide that kind of support. But again, a lot of the training has not really focused on the intersection of trauma and grief.
So, Jolie, we're talking now about really kind of the first responders who themselves are affected. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And how does that show up? And it's not just those that want to parachute in, right? The Good Samaritan sense, but it's even for people who do this on a regular basis. Tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that even sometimes it can be that it almost hits too close to home when you are a person who lives in that community and works in that community, and then you're being asked to step up and help these families in that first responder way. That can be even more overwhelming because it's personalized in a way. So I think that, one of the things that we're really trying to do is, again, address that before it happens. So helping to give people the coping skills needed before they rush in, and also recognizing their own threshold. I'll just share a personal anecdote. After the Uvalde tragedy, the Robb Elementary School shooting, I had a couple of clinicians who literally said to me, I will do all the training and consultation that you want me to do, but I cannot go out there. I cannot go out and help these grieving families, partially because the children who died were the exact same age as their own children. And it felt like, again, hitting too close to home. They were not going to be able to do that. And so I think part of this is recognizing their own threshold for what can they tolerate, what can they do without, making it a situation where they themselves are actually needing that mental health support.
Julie, you were in Uvalde, I know, and so you're saying that kind of the first responders who lived in Uvalde, uh, they were overwhelmed. So how did that get fixed?
Yeah. Well, we do a lot of training and workshops in the aftermath of these tragedies to help individuals cope with what they're seeing and hearing. And sometimes that can look like debriefing or processing groups for adults. We did that a lot with teachers in the aftermath of the Uvalde shooting and the aftermath really recently of the Central Texas flooding, to help them process what's happening. Because sometimes, if this is a new territory, which hopefully it is for most people, we're not bombarded with these tragedies very frequently. It can be overwhelming. People will say, like, I feel like I'm going crazy. I'm being reminded of what's happened and not really understanding why or how I'm reacting in the way I'm reacting. So a lot of this is really educating people about what does post-traumatic stress look like, what does secondary traumatic stress look like, and how can they cope with that. And for a lot of the teachers that we worked with, this was sort of a new language for them, really understanding that even just hearing the stories of children who had lost loved ones was, very difficult for them to handle.
Julie, so in specifically with Uvalde, did we then have to bring people in from the outside who were not directly connected? Is that how
Yes.
did you proceed? Tell us how you figured that out.
Sure. I mean, the Uvalde tragedy was really a joint effort with many, many different organizations that were able to come in and assist. So sometimes it can actually be really helpful to have outside organizations step in when they are not directly impacted. We always talk about how impacted people should not be necessarily helping impacted people. And so that's been incredibly helpful to have those kinds of partnerships. So, for example, after the Uvalde tragedy, we worked very closely with the TCHAT programs. Those are, I always forget the actual acronym, but it's those programs that are set up in the schools that allow for brief sessions, up to 6 sessions for kids who've experienced trauma or hardship. But we've partnered with them for them to be able to get trained and step in. So there are, lots of different organizations that I don't have the ability to mention that have stepped in and really helped in the aftermath.
Let's talk about the storms. Now, I don't know if you know about the Convoy of Hope. That's somebody I should put you in touch with because when there's a problem somewhere, they're there. It's unbelievable, and they don't hesitate. I would take it that those folks who get to be sort of storm experts, whether it's tornadoes, whether it's hurricanes, what kind of training do you think? Well, first of all, do most of them get trained? How does it work? And what are we observing now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, to be honest with you, I'm not completely familiar with that particular organization.
Right, right.
I think that a lot of the organizations that do step in the immediate aftermath have some training. Again, what we hear time and time again is that trainings focused on trauma and helping traumatized victims look different than trainings where you are, encountering families that are deep in their grief and mourning. And that can look very different. It can feel very different for those who are helping. And so that's the piece of the training that is sometimes missing that we're able to kind of step in and guide people around, even in terms of how to deal sensitively with a grieving child who is standing right in front of you, or grieving parents who are looking at the circumstances that caused their child to die. That is a very different kind of sensitivity that doesn't often, resemble closely what we would do if it was just simply a trauma. And I don't want to minimize this, but a trauma related to, a house not, a house falling apart in the aftermath of a hurricane. That is different than the death of a loved one. And so that's kind of where we make that distinction and help to train others in how to respond sensitively in a grief sensitive way.
Julie, so let's say that I know the Convoy of Hope's going all over the place, and I know those men and women go down to these areas. If you do it enough times, if you're sort of a veteran of being a first responder, is that easier for them, or is it the same no matter what we're talking about? I mean, you understand what I mean by that? Do you begin to understand how to cope with it, or is it require all the time for somebody? Take the wildfires in California, right? I
Yeah.
mean, there's so many things that we see. How how do these people do they get better at as many times as they go?
Yeah. I've seen it go both ways. I have seen some first responders who, over time, almost become a little bit desensitized to those situations where they're able to go in and sort of kind of separate themselves a little bit, where they're able to really do their job and not necessarily absorb the trauma and the grief that they're seeing. Alternatively, I've also seen first responders where they almost reach a threshold where that cumulative effect of having seen
Yeah.
tragedy
Yeah.
after tragedy can start to take a toll over time.
Julie, I have a friend from Canada who did a lot of mountain rescues. And I used to be amazed at the stories he would tell. And I asked him, um, why he was retiring. And he said, I've done so many of these rescues that I'm now starting to be afraid of when I do them. And that's when I knew it was time to go.
Mhm.
How does that strike you?
Yeah, I think that totally resonates. I think some people do reach a point where they're recognizing that the emotional toll that it's having on them is actually preventing them from doing that job, and doing it well and really, being present for those situations.
What kind of a person? So let's say that people are watching and they say, well, I'd like to get into that. I'd like to, first of all, don't go running into something, right? I mean, don't just show up, right? Because that's part of what you're saying. But secondly, is there a particular type of person who, if you're thinking about what you want to do, is there a person who's got potentially more resilience than others? Just kind of elaborate.
That's such a good question. I, again, have seen both scenarios where sometimes people who are the most passionate about wanting to do this work have themselves survived that kind of a tragedy, or themselves have experienced trauma or loss, and so feel driven and compelled to work with that population. And those are some of the best clinicians, therapists, first responders I've ever met. I've also seen it where, sometimes if people have not fully processed their own traumas or losses and then go into these kinds of situations, they're at much higher risk for experiencing burnout or compassion fatigue because they themselves are still grappling with, the mental health issues associated with trauma and loss.
All right, so can you recover?
Absolutely.
Tell us about your results, what you've seen in some of these tough situations.
Yeah. So I think it's really important to note that for those, we know with kids, for example, who experience trauma, that only 25% of them are at risk for developing full blown PTSD. That's where we have the re experiencing, the hypervigilance, the avoidance, all of those symptoms. So it's not everybody who's going to develop PTSD. That being said, we know that there are some very effective interventions for kids and adults who have PTSD. And these are some of the interventions that we've widely disseminated after these kinds of tragedies. So, one intervention that we've used very frequently is called trauma and grief component therapy. The beauty of this intervention is that it's flexibly tailored. So, it can be used individually or in groups of kids. It can be used through teletherapy or in person. And it's designed to really identify what are the main issues that that particular child or student is having. So there's a trauma processing component, there's a grief processing component, there's a piece to it where it's about how to get back onto a healthy trajectory, what are their goals for the future. So we've used that in the aftermath of literally almost every tragedy we've encountered in Texas. So Hurricane Harvey, the Santa Fe school shooting, the Uvalde school shooting, and more recently, we're using it now with the Central Texas flooding. What we see, though, is that after they've been through even just the first phase of that intervention, significant reductions in post-traumatic stress, depression, grief reactions, even suicide risk. And it also enhances school behavior. So we find that kids who go through that program actually are more connected to school and peers, are better able to learn, actually have improvements in grades. And so, that's actually how we've gotten buy-in from many of the school districts after these tragedies, is recognizing the impact not just on their mental health, but on their school-related behaviors.
Jolie, you've seen lots of these things. So how are you doing? And
Thank
what do
you.
what do you do to try to not be overwhelmed?
Yeah, that's a very nice, thoughtful question. I first of all have an amazing team of people. So this is not as if I'm just going in by myself. I've got 18 people who work with me who are just fabulous clinicians and researchers. And so that's a big part of it. I feel like I've got this amazing group. I also truly believe in what people refer to as vicarious resilience. So in seeing kids get better, in seeing adults get better, in recognizing that the things that we're doing are actually helping them to recover, that is incredibly empowering. And that feeling of, wow, this is actually working, tends to buffer that overwhelming feeling of, this is a horrific tragedy. So I think that's kind of what's been able to buffer me. And also recognizing, that I need to have my own boundaries. I spend a lot of time with my family, my friends. I really try to compartmentalize so that I'm not taking all of that home with me on a daily basis.
There's a lot of burnout. I've done work, as you know, with Meadows for quite a while now, and it's an amazing organization. When we think about the counselors, the people that have to deal with this, um, there's such a high burnout. Is there a way for people to not, who are really dedicated to this? Because there are people that I can think of now who I know who do these things. Uh, is there something they can do to sort of protect themselves? Do we think about counseling the counselors? I guess is the question.
Absolutely. And there are things that can be done sort of at the organizational level and at the individual level. So, for example, the other hat that I wear is that I manage our group practice that is basically the clinical affiliate of the Trauma and Grief Center. It's called the Lucene Center for Trauma and Grief, and we provide teletherapy to kids across the state of Texas who experience trauma and grief. And one of the things that I have found is that there's sort of a critical threshold for the number of cases that we assign to clinicians where the case itself is trauma or grief related. So we actually cap people's face-to-face therapeutic hours at 16 hours a week, which is significantly less, believe it or not, than most hospital settings, most outpatient settings. And the reason being that when we go beyond those 16 hours, that is when we really start to see burnout and compassion fatigue. So, there's sort of a managerial aspect of that in terms of ensuring that people don't get burnt out with the cases. But there's also, things that people can do on an individual basis. And, some of the things seem almost too simple, but literally things like, taking a walk in the middle of the day, doing deep breathing exercises, finding things that are soothing to you that you can incorporate throughout your day. Even those little things make a huge difference. And, even just being aware of when you're starting to feel overwhelmed, taking a break at that point. And, we talk about this a lot at the Trauma and Grief Center in terms of, it is not a weakness. It is not a vulnerability to say, I've got to stop right now, or, I've got to take a break because,
Yeah.
that's insight. That is what we need to hear from people in order to prevent the burnout.
Yeah, I mean, just box breathing,
Yeah.
4 deep breaths in, hold for 6, out for 7, and you
Yep.
do it 4 times. It's amazing what it
Yeah.
can do to kind of calm you down. Do EMTs have this kind of problem too? We know lots of them, and tell us about that.
Yeah. I
Do they
think
need to be trained, right?
yes, absolutely. I think any profession where you are encountering this level of trauma and loss daily, there needs to be some scaffolding around that. And whether it's training, whether it's preparing people, whether it's from an organizational perspective, recognizing the need for people to have easy access to mental health support, whatever that looks like, I think absolutely those are populations that we're really worried about.
Yeah, I know that the Ohio State Highway Patrol is taking, one of my old friends over there is involved in trying to help these officers who get themselves in a sticky situation, and sometimes, situations that are really ugly. And I know they're beginning to do that. Julie, when we talk about all these things, both the PTSD for those who are providing the aid, we also know there's PTSD on people who receive the aid, and you do both of those, of course. Those are both of the things you do. How does the element of faith work into this?
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked that because, what we have found is that really the number one trauma that actually produces more of a focus on spiritual beliefs is bereavement. So, in other words, when we look at things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, being in a natural disaster, domestic violence, car accidents, whatever it is actually the death of a loved one that propels people to really call upon their religion, their spiritual beliefs. And that makes sense if you think about those circumstances. When someone dies, especially for children, so much of what they're grappling with is there a heaven? Can they still see me? Can they hear me? Can I still feel connected? Will I ever see them again? So much of that is wrapped up in their own spiritual beliefs, their family's beliefs. And so there is, we actually just recently developed a measure of spirituality for children because we were seeing this so frequently that they weren't being given the space to actually explore those things. But once they did, it was as if it opened an incredibly important new doorway for helping them to cope with their losses.
Julie, I have to tell you, I'm kind of smiling because I had dinner the other night, and their parents were there, and there were 3 kids, 2 boys, soccer players. It's what they love. They're the little sister, soccer player, and I asked them all, "Do you pray?"
Mhm.
And 2 of the 3 said no.
Mm.
And I said, "Well, and not that I'm on here to proselytize, but I want to say this, is I said, well, the reason you pray is because you got the most important and biggest being that ever existed, who made you and has a purpose for you and loves you.
Yeah.
And it's like having a buddy. I didn't make my goal today. I didn't kick it in there, and I'm so upset. But you know what? You got a friend that can understand your problems and your frustrations, right? So I always just raise it, and I don't go on, and I don't even know what the parents say. I don't try to shove anything down anybody's throats, but the idea that there is a being that loves you and supports you through thick and thin, to me, is not a substitute for the kind of hard work that you do with the psychology, but I think they go hand in hand. What's your sense of that? I mean, it's both. It's faith, but it's also hard work.
Yeah. And, I think one of the sad things about my profession, in terms of psychology and even psychiatry, is that those fields have really shied away from incorporating faith and religiosity and spirituality into the work. In fact, we were sort of taught very early on in my training, at least, that you don't dabble in that, you don't bring that in necessarily. And again, what we're finding with bereavement is that it's really important to give voice to those things if the family believes in that. And, I'll share a story with you. I was working with a young girl, this was several years ago, whose father died. She was 12 years old. And she talked about how at nighttime she would pray to her dad. And she felt as if he was responding to her in some way. She felt comforted by what she perceived to be sort of a sense of, he's still with me. And when I brought that to our team, this was prior to Meadows, so another place
Right.
altogether. When I brought that to our multidisciplinary team, one of the psychiatrists said, we need to get her on meds immediately. She's hallucinating. I had to explain, actually, this is a very protective coping mechanism for her, that she feels like she can pray, that she gets the response she wants. And who are we to say what it is she's experiencing? This is something that we would never want to rid her of, given that it's so helpful to her, that it's a coping strategy for her. So, I think we've moved ahead a little bit in terms of
We
incorporating
need to.
that, but I agree, it's a really
And look,
overlooked.
it's not magic. It's not a rapid foot. When these things happen, it's tragic. No matter how much faith you have,
Right.
it's tragic. However, it can over time and maybe even in the moment give you some sense of perspective,
Yes.
that you're not gasping because, Julie, I in my life, I was in an experience where my loss was so terrible that everything, the world was black with a little pinprick of light. But I also then had somebody suggest to me about faith, and I didn't really have that much in a real sense, but it turned a light on somehow. It made things easier for me to think about and deal with. And then I explored all that. So I think it's both. I think it's both the faith issue and not proselytizing, but the
Right.
faith in a simple way, and also the hard work that has to be done. So when you hear about Jamaica, when you hear about part of Cuba,
Yeah.
when you think about people going there, it's not just a bunch of people it's just not a bunch of people going there. You see those people, am I right?
Oh,
How does
absolutely.
your mind work when you hear about these things?
Yeah, I think that similar to what we've been talking about, my mind always goes to, I hope they feel equipped to deal with what they're about to encounter, and we've seen so many times where, again, and this is not to discourage people from helping, but I think recognizing what are my limitations, what is it that I don't know, before diving into something like that. And there are many, many organizations out there that have the expertise, the experience, the wherewithal to know what they're getting into. I do worry about folks who just want to help, are not prepared, and then are completely overwhelmed themselves.
So maybe the first thing we should do is think about, you ready for this? Is something you never heard. Send money.
Yeah.
Well, and I think these organizations then have a responsibility to
Yeah.
show them that the money is actually going.
Right.
I mean, I keep promoting Convoy because I love them. 91 cents out of every dollar. My wife and I just did a video trying to help raise a little bit of money for the efforts they were going to be making in Jamaica. But, I think if these organizations can show, it's nonsense, it's not going into overhead, that's a good thing. And then maybe at some point, right? At some point, maybe they can actually show up.
Yeah.
Tell me about that sequence. How would that work?
Yeah. I think that what we really are trying to do is kind of identify where people's expertise lie, right? So there are some people who might rush in the more immediate aftermath because their expertise is crisis response, and that's what they're prepared to do. There are others, like the majority of therapists that I've encountered, who are much more accustomed to longer term treatment and longer term therapy, who really are not equipped to go in and deal with that more
Right.
immediate response. And so I think sort of recognizing where the skills are and having people, align themselves with what's needed in that particular area.
Julie, I hope everybody that's watched this can see why I can't wait till I see her in person. I give her the biggest hug ever. And she's just fantastic and doing the Lord's work. There's no question, along with Meadows. And So, Jolie, it's thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope that people will learn from this. That you just don't rush in. Maybe you send some money for those who are in the middle of all this. You have a loved one; it's a fireman, a policeman, EMT, whatever. Make sure that they're getting the training that they need, so they don't stumble upon something and go, oh, they got to be prepared. And for all of us, thank you for what you and so many of the first responders do. You're at risk too. That's kind of the message here. You're at risk in many respects, not quite like those who were affected, but there is a risk to you as well. So they really are our heroes, aren't they? You are all our heroes. So thank you, Jolie.
Thank you so much.
And we'll see you soon.